Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year.
Hello and welcome to Carbon Politics. Today we discuss sovereign debt and climate action. The issue of sovereign debt has ballooned at various points in history. In recent decades, though, it is spoken about in the context of low and middle income countries and their inability to meet their climate targets. In a recent fact sheet, CSE highlighted that, excluding China, low and middle income countries require about $1 trillion in external climate finance for their domestic climate needs annually. Yet, just in 2023 alone, they spent $970 billion in external debt repayments. So the issue is concurrent and serious. Last year, debt was elevated by developing countries as a major hindrance to their climate and development goals at the 4th Financing for Development Conference, or FFD4, in Seville. The outcome of the Seville conference carried little relief for debt-burdened economies, with some movement on debt pause clauses and the creation of the Seville Forum on Debt, which will be useful for debtor economies to coordinate debt restructuring and management. It also precipitated the formation of the Borrowers Forum, which could be a meaningful outcome where indebted countries can gain some collective bargaining power in this process. Given the active efforts from civil society and research groups, the crisis of sovereign debt has come to the fore once again, but developing countries are still awaiting transformative solutions. To speak to this issue and help us understand this unfolding crisis, we are joined by Marina Zucker-Marques. Marina is a senior academic researcher at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, where she focuses on sovereign debt, the global financial safety net, international finance, and currency internationalization. Marina, welcome to Carbon Politics. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin by unpacking the role sovereign debt plays in a country's development trajectory itself. Is all debt considered bad, or when does it become a problem? Can you speak to us about the crisis that we are seeing in the world right now for low and middle income countries?
I think there are good and bad debt, actually. And if we have any chance to mobilize enough resources for climate and, development goals, there is no way but actually mobilize more of the good debt. The problem today is that we are stuck in a deadlock, or what economists would say, a low-level equilibrium, where we have a legacy debt stock, which is not actually that good of a debt. And because of this situation, we cannot mobilize better, good debt. And what would be a good debt? I would say first, with low interest rate, we know in a level that is below country's GDP, because if you're growing faster than your interest rate, means that you have a capacity to repay. Is also longer maturity, productive, and also constant, which is not volatile. Unfortunately, this is not the type of debt that emerging markets, developing economies are able to mobilize today. We see a lot of countries contracting very high interest rate debt because markets see their economy as very risk. They charge a very high premium. It's often very short, very speculative, and very procyclical. And the sources of debt that actually are stable and more productive, that is from development financial institutions, from multilateral development banks, they actually are very scarce. So, and there are studies, we've been, part of the conversation in the G20, in the COP, And multilateral development banks, they need to at least triple their lending capacity. And it's not what's happening. So MDBs that are a good type of debt, they actually account for around 0.6% of countries' gross national income. It's less than 1%. And it's really short to actually we need. They're disbursing around 200 billion per year, which is very, low comparing to the needs of like 1 trillion that we need to mobilize in external resources. So we need to find a way to solve this deadlock. And one way we need to solve this legacy debt, flush out of the system this debt that is not so good, and we need to mobilize good, better debt.
If you can also bring in climate to this equation, is this debt crisis, if we want to call it that, is it also impeding developing countries' climate goals and climate action?
Definitely. And it's hindering climate goals, health, education. And that's because it's really hard to reduce the debt service, the debt that you're obliged to repay to creditors. So it's much easier for you to, one, cut the social spending in your country, politically speaking, or simply forgo the investments that, that are the climate actions required. So we see that more or less, for instance, in Africa. The amount that they need to mobilize in climate investments is more or less the amount that they are going to pay back to creditors. And this means that instead of, investing in goals that are needed, education, climate, they're actually cutting these needs to make sure that they pay creditors back. And the key problem, the seed of this problem is that we don't have a global framework to allow countries to solve the debt problem. So if you say like, I need to mobilize this amount of climate finance, I need to invest this amount, there is no international rule that says you should reduce your debt to creditors by this amount, and then this is going to give you fiscal space. And this is completely different from, for instance, the case of companies. So here in the US where I work, the US has a bankruptcy code. If you're a company, for instance, and you cannot pay your employers and your debt back, there will be a series of processes that allow you to restructure your debt, to allow you to, be back on your feet or close your company. This is not a case of countries. If countries cannot pay their debt back, they go through a very complex and political process, and it's very costly. So if I can walk you through the process, if that's helpful for people to understand how this, undermines the climate investment mobilization. So if you cannot pay your debt back, you first go to the IMF. The IMF is going to conduct something called a debt sustainability analysis, where they're going to judge if your debt is sustainable or not. If they say that actually your debt is sustainable, you can pay it back, it's just a temporary liquidity crash, they're going to allow you to have an IMF program, and they're going to lend you money. The problem is that if you borrow from the IMF, you're subject to conditionalities. 2/3 more or less of IMF conditionalities is fiscal. They request you to cut, to increase your government's surplus. So it means that you need to cut your budget. And usually, you're going to cut what is politically easier. Often it's on climate and social spending. So even if your debt is sustainable, you may see conditionalities. If your debt is unsustainable, then the IMF asks you to restructure with your creditors. And this is a process that takes, it's very complex, takes years. We see the case of Ghana, for instance. They are in the 4th year of that restructuring. During this period, creditors don't want to lend you any money because they see you as very risk. And the G20 has, tried to speed up the process, but even as you can see in the case of Ghana, is not speeding much still. So, and also when you restructure, the expectation is that you are going to receive enough debt relief that it allowed you to actually restart investments in climate and social priority. But it's also not the case, because usually the IMF model, they show you that your debt is sustainable if you cut very little, if you have a very thin cut in your debt. And that what actually happens is that you're falling from the precipice, and after restructure, you're just back to the top of the precipice again. And it's very easy for you to fall again. So what we need is like faster debt relief, we need to speed up the process, and we also need more debt relief. Then after the country, solve their debt legacy problem, they actually are going to have enough fiscal space to invest in climate mobilization. Without us, if we can't, there is no fiscal space enough.
Right. And I think it also connects to like our next question, which is if we think about solutions, where are the most promising forums? Where is the political momentum to resolve this crisis? If you could also speak to that a little bit.
I think on a bright note, we see some developments from the multilateral development banks. There has been some the credit rating methodology of this, that judge if these countries, if the NDBs can leverage more or less capital. They have been revised, and this is giving more lending room from the MDBs. The MDBs themselves are revising their risk appetite. That means that they are going to have more space to give more like good debt that we were talking at the beginning.
Right.
It's expected that in the next 10 years, they are going to have, additional lending space upwards to 400 billion in the next 10 years. This is good news. This year, part of the G20, American G20, within the American priority is to enhance that transparency and facilitate that restructuring if necessary. We are going to see how it's going to play out. I think everything is open in the air, how it's going to play out. We know that transparency can be very political. That transparency is good, and we should be promoting it. But especially in the geopolitical context of the US and China, this can get very geopolitical, and it is not going to be helpful for developing countries. I think this year can also be a year of countries learning and giving, space to think what is their strategy. The UN and especially UNCTAD, they're helping countries to organize a borrows forum. That is basically a space where debtors can exchange information, because if you're a bureaucrat from a country that is experiencing debt relief, most likely is your first time experiencing this. So sharing from other countries can be very important. So I think this can be a space for countries to learn how to deal. And there are some also expectations that next year in the UK G20, they may pick up that discussion with more ambition. So this is something that we can expect. From the IMF side, my last point is that this year there are the IMF every 5-6 years, they review their policies. And the year of 2026 is the year they are going through two very important review of the conditionality, which is just I talked in the beginning, where they actually can squeeze the fiscal space of developing countries when they go to IMF program. This is something that is being reviewed this year, and also the debt sustainability analysis, which I just talked how important they are to assess how much debt is sustainable and how much debt relief the country needs. These are the two reviews that are under process in the IMF. So this is where the space for change and opportunity lie, I think, in 2026.
Right, some very critical points in there, especially the IMF reviews that are happening. Could we also, you've in your recent work, you've spoken about China as well, playing a deeper role in development finance in the global South. I suppose we need some nuance to this, because China has been accused of perpetuating a debt trap, according to certain narratives, but there's also disputes to that claim. Where do you see this China's role shifting in the global South, financing, development financing, and climate financing in the coming years?
Yeah, I think the key point is how to make the Chinese lending that is good to revive. But if I just can pick on the debt trap discourse, this is not precise academically, and if you look to the facts, we know that China actually has been very active in giving debt relief and extension. In 2022, there was a program from the G20 to suspend the debt of many developing countries. In China, although they were lending 30%, the stock for developing countries, they rescheduled 63%. So this goes at the odds of the narrative of the debt trap. They could be doing more, but this is at odds with the narrative. But I think overall, the Chinese lending has been very important to fill a gap, especially in Africa. So Africa has a huge infrastructure gap. And we know having like public infrastructure, having, access to sanitation, to water, to trains is actually, it's development. And it also can be very green, and especially now that Chinese technology is advancing to this area. So having Chinese investments can be good, can fill a gap. Legacy institutions, they don't lend to infrastructure anymore. They used to be. Now they are very focused on access to like schools, health, which is good, but is not the gap that the Chinese lending fulfills. So it's really important. And in the last, 25 years, basically China put a new African Development Bank in terms of lending in Africa. So it's very big. It can be very important. The problem is
Right.
after the COVID, with the his risk perception on the sky, many lenders, including China, don't want to disburse new lending. And this means
Mm.
that the lending that was done 10 years ago, the peak was 2017. Now they started to be repaid, right? Because that is maturing and they are repaying. So
Right.
countries are actually repaying more debt back than they are receiving new debt from China. And this causes
Mm.
something that is the net negative flows, which
Mm.
increases, the debt pressures of developing countries because they cannot refinance anymore. They don't want to go to the IMF because they're going to be, facing conditionalities. They don't want to have other
Mm.
sources of liquidity. So what are we calling to? So some people are saying China is extractive. I don't think this is a case of China being extractive, but there is a problem of repayment mismatches that we need to solve. And without solving this, we are not going to revive the Chinese lending that is productive. So what our
Mm.
recent paper, are suggesting, and this is something that we recently also looked to the case of Kenya, which is going in that direction, which is good. So we are saying to escape from this low level equilibrium, this deadlock that we are facing. First, China could take the current loans that they have for, countries in Africa and other regions and
Mm.
refinance in RMB because the Chinese currency today, the interest rate in the Chinese market is very low, is around 1.5%, which is very close to the concessional lending from the World Bank. So if you
Right.
refinance this in a new currency, this can give you lower interest rate and can save you, money, help you with solving the problem. But this is not going to
Mm.
be enough. Countries need to receive new lending that is productive to help them grow and actually be able to repay the debt back. This means that they need
Mm.
new sovereign lending, but also new FDI because companies, if they help, there is manufacturing companies and companies that help grow, this is going to generate more government revenues and making the country grow and repay. And also, it's important that these countries trade more with China and they export more to China because if you export more and you receive, income in dollars or in RMB, it's going to facilitate your ability to repay that back. So all this
Yeah.
package together can actually help developing countries to leave this low level equilibrium. And if I can very quickly finalize with the case of Kenya, for instance, this is something that China started to do with some countries. So Kenya recently refinance their extended the maturity of their debt with the Export-Import Bank of China. And this means that
Mm.
they reduced the interest rate from previously around 6% to now 3% with a longer period.
Okay.
And this means that Kenya, at least from servicing Chinese debt, it's going to be like less pressure. And what we're saying,
Yeah.
and we just published a blog on this, is that this should be complemented with new Chinese lending that is cheaper, that is productive, with
Yeah.
FDI and more trade. This is going to be, the way out of this debt crisis, and then allowed investments in climate and all the social priority that developing countries have.
Right. Absolutely. I think in that same vein, it's crucial for the global financial outlook to change. Like the global south countries are, as you said in the beginning, this looked at is so risky and debt-ridden, but not recognizing the development imperative and the climate imperative and the economic benefits that climate-aligned development can bring. I think it's very important that that outlook can shift as soon as possible. Um, on that note, Marina, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much. Bye.
That's all for today's podcast. Thank you for watching Carbon Politics. Do subscribe to the Down to Earth YouTube channel for most such informative content.